There are few conflicts in the world today that have gotten as much attention as what is happening in the Middle East. This is a conflict that has involved Israel, Iran, America, Syria, Lebanon, and threatens to become a wider regional conflict that could engulf the entire Middle East. This is a truly complex conflict, but luckily today we've got someone for you who can help us understand what's going on in the region and how the conflict is going to evolve in the days and months to come. I'd like to welcome Dana Stroul, who is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She was also, until very recently, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East at the Pentagon, so someone with a lot of experience, both as a scholar as well as a diplomat. Dana Stroul, thank you so much for joining us. Could you begin by telling us something about where the conflict is right now? Could I ask you perhaps to start with the death of Hezbollah chief Syed Nasrallah? Was that a tipping point for Iran in this conflict?
So, first of all, I think it's important to remember where this all started, which is October 7th, when Hamas invaded Israel and brutally killed over 1,000 Israeli citizens. And Hamas is an Iran-backed, trained, armed, and funded terrorist group, as is Hezbollah in Lebanon, who on October 8th, less than 24 hours after that October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas, also started to attack Israel. And over this past year, from October 7th until now, a variety of Iran-backed group, militias in Iraq and Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, have all escalated against Israel and also attacked U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. The Houthis are attempting to shut down international commercial traffic in the Red Sea. Hezbollah's missiles have caused more than 65,000 Israelis to flee northern Israel. And in April, we actually saw Iran launch a direct attack on Israel, which is different than anything we've seen for all of the decades past. I also think it's important to think about the October 1st attack on Israel. Iran sent 180 ballistic missiles into Israel. No country does that without intent to kill a lot of people and destroy a lot of infrastructure. So these are acts of war and acts of terrorism. And what Israel has been working to do is degrade these threats so that they can no longer threaten Israel or Israeli citizens.
Dina, could I also ask you something about what we're seeing happening between Israel and Iran? Israel has vowed to hit Iran hard for what's happening in the region. Iran has threatened to retaliate as well. What is at stake for the leaders of Israel and Iran, Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as the Supreme Leader of Iran, Khamenei?
So it's a really important question. And what President Biden has said since October 7th is that he was going to support Israel's ability to defend itself, but he wanted to prevent an all-out regional war. Now, I think you could reasonably argue that the region is already in war right now. When you have an Iran-backed group in Yemen shooting missiles and drones toward commercial shipping in the Red Sea, when you have Iran sending 180 ballistic missiles at Israel and Israel thinking about how and when it responds, this is war, but it could be so much worse. So Iran has not only threatened to target Israel again, it's also threatened all of the countries in the Gulf who host U.S. forces, that if they participate or allow their airspace to be used for an Israeli response, they are at risk for Iranian aggression as well. So now what Washington is very focused on is preventing an even worse regional war where Iran is not only looking at what damage it can do in Israel, but the rest of the region as well. So think about shutting down the Straits of Hormuz, more collateral damage and civilian casualties across the entire Middle East. That's what Washington is very focused on preventing at this time. And I believe that what was happening in that phone call between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu is that Biden has been very clear that no country should accept 180 ballistic missiles targeting its territory, and that Israel has a right to respond and defend itself, but it has to do it in a calibrated way that does not escalate into what could be an even worse regional war.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for breaking that down for us, Jane. I think it was a very important part of what's been happening in the region, understanding what's happening between Israel and Iran. Could I also ask you something that has gotten a lot of attention? There was recently a phone conversation between Joe Biden as well as the Prime Minister of Israel. There are reports that Israel might start targeting Iranian oil facilities and nuclear program sites. Do you see that happening?
So, on the one hand, I think that Israelis are certainly feeling emboldened and that they have strategic momentum behind their military actions. And when you think about it, when you think about that Hezbollah started these attacks on October 8th, and for the past year, there has been this calculated exchange or tit for tat where Hezbollah targets drones or missiles or anti-tank missiles at northern Israel. Israel responds, but it's mostly been limited to northern Israel and southern Lebanon. And then there was this tipping point where Hezbollah killed 12 Druze children playing soccer in the north of Israel, in Israeli occupied territory. And then we have seen this escalation of Israel using exquisite intelligence and very precise military operations to take out senior leaders. So, for example, the Hezbollah number 2, Fuad Shukr, in downtown Beirut, but done in a way to not cause big civilian casualties or collateral damage. Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas in Tehran, the following day, same thing, in a VIP guest house of the Iranian government, which is very embarrassing to the government of Iran, but done in a way to not cause collateral damage and civilian casualties. But what Israel is saying is that we're not going to accept this level of aggression and terrorism and attacks on us. And what I think is different about this moment in time is that Israel has eliminated the entire senior leadership of Lebanese Hezbollah. It has taken out more than 50% of its missile and drone arsenal, which means 50% less weapons to attack Israeli citizens with. And now Israel's thinking, well, Hezbollah has been the primary insurance policy for the regime in Tehran. There was always a thought that if the regime in Tehran felt threatened by Israel, it would use Hezbollah and Hezbollah's missile arsenal to really strain the security and the defense establishment of Israel in a war. And now a lot of that has been decimated. And so the question is, for Israel, is there more than it can do? And for Washington, the challenge is it has worked for over a year to prevent an all-out regional war where even more of the region's citizens and the region's governments are dragged in, where there's more collateral damage, where trade and energy stability in global markets is destabilized. It could just be much worse. And so that's exactly the conversation that Jerusalem and Washington are having today, which is how can Israel take actions that support its defense, but not in a way that contributes to further escalation. I can't speak to what the private conversation was between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden, but President Biden has been very clear publicly about the sets of targets that he would not support Israel striking in Iran. He's been clear that he does not support military strikes on Iran's nuclear program. And last Friday in a press briefing, President Biden said he did not support attacks on Iranian oil infrastructure. Part of that is because once you start attacking energy infrastructure, it probably opens up a case for Iran to say, well, now we're going to attack Israeli energy infrastructure or other energy infrastructure in the region. So these are some of the considerations, and I imagine some of the debate happening right now.
We've also been talking a lot about the internal stability of a country like Iran. We're talking about foreign policy a lot as well, but Iran is a country that has seen a lot of domestic troubles in the past. There was a mass uprising post the death of a young woman, Mahsa Amini, against the regime of Iran at this point in time. Is the country internally stable enough to face a conflict with Israel and a wider conflict in the Middle East?
No, I do not think Iran is prepared for an all-out war in the Middle East. And knowing that its conventional military capabilities are completely outmatched by American military capabilities, and that the United States has long-standing defense partnerships and strategic relationships with the countries of the Gulf, with Egypt, Jordan, and Israel, this was part of the justification for Iran cultivating this network of terrorists and non-state actors. So because the regime in Iran recognizes that it cannot compete with conventional military capabilities, it invested asymmetrically. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the militias in Iraq and Syria, Hamas in Gaza, on and on. The difference today is that many of those terrorist groups, especially Hamas and Hezbollah, are very degraded and cannot be relied upon by Tehran the way they could before October 7th, 2023. And so part of this, I think, is that the regime is thinking through what can it do to not be further strained. Again, this is an interesting moment in time because you have the newly elected and inaugurated president of Iran, President Pezeshkian, who actually came to New York for the United Nations General Assembly, openly talking about interest in engaging with the West again and in diplomacy to address the kinds of concerns the West has about Iran's destabilizing activities. So I also think there's a big dilemma here for Tehran. It's invested tremendous amounts of resources in its nuclear program and in cultivating this network of terrorists and proxies. And right now, it's not actually making the regime safer. So they could pick another path, and that's one of de-escalation and engaging with the West. And to do that, they would have to come back into a compliance with their agreements in the Iran nuclear program. They would have to stop funding and arming and training and proliferating very sophisticated weapons to this network of terrorists. And I think it remains to be seen whether or not the supreme leader in Tehran is willing to do that.
Dina, I would like you to, if you could zoom out a little bit as well. We're talking about a conflict in Ukraine at this point in time, where we have Russia and America, as well as Europe, involved in a deep conflict. We also have what's happening in West Asia right now, two very important strategic regions of the world involved in a conflict. Do you see, the possibility of us heading towards a global sort of conflict, or do you believe that these are separate regional conflicts at this point in time?
I think there certainly are structural indicators and early signs and warnings that this could become World War III. When you look at the level of disinformation and misinformation, foreign interference in many, many countries, democratic processes and internal affairs, the weapons buildup, the nuclear threshold capability that Iran is seeking to develop, this deepening strategic alignment between Russia and China and Iran and North Korea, these are very, very concerning signs. And I think a better way to think about what we're seeing right now is a competition between two coalitions. On the one side, it's the United States with NATO and working with as many other partners as possible, including, of course, India, who is a major defense partner of the United States. And the hope is that these countries all working together see the benefit of the existing international order that has tilted towards addressing climate change, addressing free trade, improving people-to-people ties, and standing up to adversaries who seek to use force unilaterally to change internationally recognized borders, which is why the United States has worked so hard to support Ukraine's defense against the Russian invasion and is working to support Israel because Israel was attacked by an Iran-backed group, and Iran seeks to hegemonically control the Middle East and dictate outcomes to the rest of those countries. And it's also why the United States has worked so hard to extend its network of alliances and partnerships in Asia so that those countries are not susceptible to coercive Chinese engagement and pressure. So it's all part of a vision. And on the other side, you have Iran and Russia and China and North Korea. China and Russia use their seats at the UN Security Council, in other international fora, use misinformation and disinformation to try to manipulate and undermine the existing order, not to the benefit of everybody else, to the benefit of leaders in Beijing and in Moscow. So all of those indicators, I think, are very, very dangerous. And it's why you see the United States, especially under the leadership of President Biden, working so hard to strengthen this existing system, to shore up and strengthen its alliances and partnerships. And I'll be very frank, in this competing coalition of competitions, India is seen as critical.
Dina, I would be remiss if I let you go without asking you about your experience as an American diplomat, someone who has handled these issues at the Pentagon, what is America's approach to this? Will America get involved directly in this conflict alongside Israel? How do you see the American approach to what's going to happen in the Middle East?
So the United States, and you look at the statements from the Pentagon, our Department of Defense, our Department of State, and from the White House, has been very clear about when and how it will use military force. It has said that it supports Israel's right to defend itself, and it is committed to defending U.S. forces in the Middle East. There are over 40,000 U.S. forces in the Middle East, and Iran has already targeted many of those forces and has threatened to do so again, and to defend American interests. And so we've seen over the past year, President Biden authorize force in two specific contexts. The first is unilateral American strikes against the Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria that were targeting and ultimately killed 3 U.S. soldiers in Jordan. So those were unilateral American strikes. And then in the case of Yemen, the United States has worked with a coalition of countries, including the UK, for multilateral strikes to degrade Houthi capabilities. What the United States has said is that it will not hesitate to use military force to protect its interests, like freedom of navigation and the free flow of commerce, and its forces like those young American men and women that I spoke of before. And so I think when President Biden says, I don't support Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure or oil facilities, he's saying not only do I not support Israel's military strikes against these kinds of targets, but the United States is not going to be involved. And what the United States has also been very clear on is that it doesn't want to escalate into full-out war. And on the other hand, what Iran doesn't want to do is have a direct military conflict with the United States, because the United States military is the strongest, most capable military in the world, and Iran's is not, especially after decades of sanctions. And so the table is set for the United States, at least to, with words, support Israel's right to defend itself, but has been very clear that it's not going to be involved in different kinds of offensive action against those targets that the president has said are off limits.
Dina Stroul, thank you so much for joining us, for telling us about what the conflict in the Middle East at this point in time, the tensions between Iran and Israel, and also how America is going to be looking at this conflict, which is an extremely crucial part of this piece. I'm going to thank you, Dina Stroul, for joining us, and thank you so much for our viewers for watching India Today Global for our ongoing coverage of the conflict in West Asia.